Okay, in this video, I'm going to very briefly introduce the idea of data colonialism. There's been an increasing amount of research and literature out there that starts to think about what's the development of what I've been calling in the course the algorithmic artificial intelligence data assemblage through the lens of colonialism and through the lens of empire. And I think this is a kind of interesting way to think about how capitalism is developing in comparison to how it developed in the past, and how the appropriation and exploitation of, in the past of things and people, in today of data and people, um, is an interesting critical way to engage with power structures of what's happening here. So drawing here upon the work of Couldry and Mejias, Data Colonialism, a highly cited journal article that they turned into a book called The Data Grab, I think. Um, and they liken the rise of, big tech essentially, and its kind of tech bro billionaires, and the way that data itself has become the key commodity of late capitalism, to earlier eras of colonialism. So they, for instance, compare it to oil. We're told that, big data is now the new oil, but data is not really a substance found in nature. It's not something that's produced and kind of mined, and with all the kind of extraction and physical processes that goes there. It's actually something that needs to be appropriated, and this is what they call data relations. They argue that there's been this new um, relations that's essentially about creating data, producing it, defining it, and it's increasingly seen as this kind of natural, kind of almost side effect of day-to-day life. And the idea here is that they can just kind of come along and take this stuff because it's, no one really cares, or it's not all that important. And it very much here resonates with the notion of terra nullius, which kind of happened in previous colonial at times, and Australia being a very good example of that. So this is kind of a really big kind of ideas paper that is trying to very much define a new era, very much a new social order. And they're very much looking through the lens of, quite neo-Marxist understandings of appropriation, of exploitation, and in some instances, a little bit less in this paper, but this is in some of the other work on this topic, alienation. What Marx argued is that, like, in capitalism, capital basically does this thing, all that solid meets into air. It's kind of constantly looking for new markets, constantly looking for new forms of extraction for profit. In data colonialism, Couldry and Mejias show that, like, essentially what's being extracted here is our lives. Every aspect of our lives is increasingly extracted and appropriated and financialized. What they call in the paper the capitalization of life without limit. Essentially, this kind of exploitation has been completely normalized in the contemporary world. So this is new types of appropriation. They argue that it's predatory, these predatory extractive practices of historical colonialism, but with abstract quantifications of computing. So it's combining that kind of previous forces with, the new kind of technology. So where in the past we had this kind of, mostly Western companies forming these huge empires through, travel and conquering and, missionary work, and particularly through violence. What we're having here is a kind of group of multinational corporations and increasingly individuals, who are household names, Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, these kind of people, who are kind of colonizing our lives through their products and through the way that we kind of increasingly rely on them as infrastructure. So this is what they call infrastructures of connection. They become kind of part of our everyday lives, but this has kind of transformed the way that we relate to each other, and it's kind of made sure that there's all these aspects of our lives that can be turned into data, bought and sold, as we've gone throughout the course, create data cells and stuff like that to be able to kind of manipulate us or get us to buy things or whatever. In terms of the lens that they're talking through here, the data colonialism, they argue, is kind of setting up preconditions for whatever the next stage of capitalism is. Um, like in colonial times, back in the 1800s, as kind of things were moving from feudalism to capitalism, it would have been hard for the kind of feudalists to understand what would develop into capitalism. They're kind of making an argument here. We're at that kind of stage at the moment. We're not sure what's going to happen next, but this new data relations system is setting up for whatever comes next. So data relations relies on extraction. And as I said already, it kind of very much, I think, is kind of has an affinity with the legal fiction of terra nullius that was used for colonial land grabs throughout the world. This is kind of very similar to what's in terms of the data grab. The idea that this stuff is just there and we're not really kind of stealing it. We're just kind of using it for our own means or whatever. But increasingly, what we are seeing is that they are stealing this stuff. There's a couple of examples you can click on in the lecture notes to see that. In terms of the creation of these AI chatbots and LLMs, Anthropic basically is now destroying books. Many of the LLMs have kind of been using what for us are illegal means. We're not as an individual, you're not allowed to go on LibGen or Anna's Archive and like download books for free. You would actually get busted doing that. You're breaking copyright and get fined probably tens of thousands of dollars for each book. But some of these platforms just use those, apparently illegal means, downloaded all the books and fed it into their algorithm, into their AI machines. And this is kind of through the notion of just break stuff, ask for permission later kind of thing, very much through that colonialist lens. Same thing's happening with images, and all the images you kind of use online, whether you own them or not, and what they can be used for is quite dubious, and the companies don't really care anyway. They just do whatever they want. So they point out some kind of different mechanics of this data colonialism. They talk about the kind of naturalization of data capture. Extractive rationalities need to be naturalized or normalized, and, even more fundamentally, the flow of everyday life must be reconfigured and represented in a form that enables its capture as data. And we've looked at that throughout the course already, through multiple different lenses. Importantly here, their argument is that this human life itself is being increasingly capitalized. Where Marx talked about kind of the extraction process for profit was about labor. That is, you would go to work, you would work for, I don't know, 8 hours a day or 20 hours a day, or whatever, depending what was going on, or with, particularly in slave labor, your whole life was labor. Um, but there was some kind of separation there between work being extracted for profit and the rest of our lives, our kind of leisure practices and our creativity and our social world or whatever. Today, our whole lives are being extracted by kind of carrying out many of those non-work things online. And this kind of speaks back to that kind of free labor, immaterial labor, effective labor. If you're using something for free, you are the product kind of thing. They see us then increasingly as data as like colonizing as subjects. And we've looked at the notion of subjectivity throughout the course, but, subjects of value. And we're increasingly, therefore, our life chances are left kind of tethered to these data judgments. Again, we've looked at this as well. Look through the kind of colonialist lens. There's a kind of, distinct power relation happening here between the way that our autonomy or our agency is very much tethered to these kind of what they see as new data colonial powers, the multinational platform capitalists. What's interesting about this, again, we've covered this as well, you will be uniquely identified by multiple corporations using different sets of data features, each sufficient to prompt a distinctive action. And we don't have a lot of autonomy about the way that we are treated through these different institutions and through these different corporations or through these different influences. Again, we're a kind of colonized subject in that way. We're made subject through these processes. Life, in this sense, they argue, becomes continuously trackable and therefore is a dispossessed life. You lose control and you lose your autonomy over what's going on. Importantly, they point out, therefore, that recognizing this dispossession, like in colonial relations, is a start of resistance to this kind of data colonialism. So they have a particularly kind of interesting way of thinking about power here. Data colonialism shows how an already powerful elite that's benefited already from these historical forms of colonialism are now driving a new version of it that goes beyond just foreclosing land, killing and displacing indigenous peoples, and destroying cultures. Goes beyond that, but it doesn't stop that. And as we'll look at the rest of this lecture, there's kind of that stuff is still really important in terms of the materiality of the digital world, the way that labor and exploitation is still key, the way the environment is being decimated. So it does this again at kind of a global level. It's kind of placeless in a way. Like there is obviously kind of key nodes where the powerful elite gather and base and all that kind of stuff, whether that's in terms of their compounds or for tax purposes or whatever. But this is happening every day continuously. Again, that's not just a workplace relation. It encloses everyone's lives and ignores our rights and laws. Again, it's just kind of this kind of notion of disruption, that Silicon Valley disruption thing has become a key way of kind of doing business. To kind of just do whatever you want, ignore the laws, ignore what people want, ignore what's happening to the places that you're at, just to kind of ensure that you get your own wants and needs. And this is, again, very similar to those colonial relations of like countries going to other lands and just kind of appropriating them. Um, yeah, and as I said already, this perspective kind of highlights the material and human costs, goes beyond those kind of money and the financializing and the data stuff. There's all those kind of human costs are still there. What I think is interesting about this, though, is that they, Couldry and Mejias kind of um, sow the seeds of possible forms of resistance to this. So, firstly, even recognizing these relations as a start, we need to kind of stop going through our life kind of blindfolded and just accepting the kind of idea that it's kind of a natural situation. So we need to kind of reject the idea that continuous collection of data from human beings is natural, let alone rational, particularly if it's not serving, human needs and human kind of flourishing and producing more suffering or enforcing more inequalities. Doesn't necessarily mean rejecting all forms of data. And some people out there are arguing that the resistive and revolutionary forces maybe can use data in their own ways to kind of fight back. But this recognition is a useful first step in terms of naming the practices as colonial and then being able to kind of form social movements to be able to resist them. Okay, I'll leave it there and come back and talk about the necropolitics of algorithmic AI assemblages.